Pandolfino, our speaker tonight, is one of those people who grew up just about everywhere. And he was first exposed to the Sierra Nevada as a teenager, fishing, hunting, backpacking, but somehow remaining completely oblivious to birds. And his first attempts at post-secondary education were less than successful, including dropping out and touring Europe as a rock drummer, which is really what I wish I had done. But he finally did manage a PhD in biochemistry from Washington State University, and then spent over 20 years working in various management positions in the medical device industry, and eventually had an eyeball-to-eyeball encounter with a spotted towhee that apparently transformed his life. And he went from oblivion to obsession in the blink of an eye. Since retiring in 1999, he has devoted himself entirely to birds, working on habitat conservation and avian research. He's president of the Western Field Ornithologists, one of the regional editors for North American Birds. In recent years, he has rediscovered his inner scientist and published more than 24 papers on status and distribution of Western birds. Some of you may remember that he gave a talk here a few years ago on rough-legged hawks in California. He's also one of the people that inspired me to start the winter raptor survey that we do here every year, now in its 7th year. And he lives in Sacramento with his wife and close to their 2 children. We are very honored to have him with us tonight to talk about birds of the Sierra Nevada. Please welcome Ed Pandolfino.
So I'm going to talk to you tonight about birds of the Sierra Nevada, and specifically about the new book at UC Press that Ted Beatty and I co-wrote, and with art by Keith Hansen. And we showed you a little bit about what's in the book, but mainly talking about the birds. And what I really try to do with this presentation more than anything else is to give you as close as I can to a virtual experience of Sierra birds. The diversity of birds in the Sierra is really, really spectacular. We cover in depth almost 300 species that are regularly occurring, but they're within the bounds of the Sierra as we define it. There have been about 440-some species observed. And so as I go through, I'm going to try to just kind of take in a transit of the Sierra from the western foothills up to the high elevations over to the east side, with just a little bit of flavor for the sorts of birds that you can find in each one of those places. And we've been giving this presentation either 1, 2, or all 3 of us in a lot of different venues around the state. And some of you may have already seen an earlier version of this, maybe Central Valley. How many people have seen this elsewhere? 2 people, okay. Your job is to pretend like you're seeing this for the first time. But to laugh at all the jokes is that you're... First thing I'd like to do is start with the acknowledgements. You leave acknowledgements till the end, and you tend to get to the point where you forget them or you have to rush through it. So we really have to thank the University of California Press for actually publishing a real paper book. There are fewer and fewer presses that are actually willing to do that. And by the way, if folks are interested, I'm willing to stay around as long as folks are willing and sell and sign books for you. I've got a few hardbacks and a fair number of paperbacks, so if you're interested in buying the book and interested in having it signed, I'll hang around back there somewhere and do that. We've got support, mainly Keith Hansen got support for the 15 years he spent doing the art from the Lucille Packard Foundation and Yosemite Conservancy. We also got some funding from Sierra Foothills and Sacramento Audubon to support some of the costs of transferring Keith's art into an electronic format. Can folks hear me? Kind of blocking you folks over there. There are some seats here if you can't see very well from that corner. There's 3 seats here and 1 more over here. Credit my co-author, Ted Beatty. He's the one with the beard here. A lot of you probably have Ted Beatty's old book, Discovering Sierra Birds, published back in the late 70s, early 80s. And at the time, really, the only book that covered in depth the entire Sierra Nevada in terms of natural history and status and distribution. And all the art in the book is by Keith Hansen, who I know a lot of folks in the room know. And the book that's out right now is a book on natural history, status and distribution, conservation. It isn't truly a field guide, but it is heavily illustrated. We used about a third of all of Keith's art, but ultimately there will be a field guide using all of his art. And you're going to see in the course of this presentation a lot of Keith's art. You're going to see a lot of photography, almost none of which I did. I'm a terrible photographer. And you're also going to hear a lot of sound recordings. I am crazy for bird sound, and so there's a lot of bird song in here. Everything you're going to hear, with I think probably no exceptions, was recorded by a good friend of Ted and mine, Barney Kroger, who has been recording birds in the Sierra for the last 20 or so years. So pretty much everything you're going to hear tonight was recorded in the Sierra by Barney. I think anybody who does any work on status and distribution of California birds has to credit Joseph Grinnell, really the father of California ornithology. He and his group at the early part of the 20th century really did the seminal work in figuring out what was here. Just really a monumental work that is still referenced routinely by all of us nearly every single day. Interesting contemporary of Joseph Grinnell is William Dawson. Not so much the hard-nosed scientist that Grinnell was, but an extremely acute observer and an extremely wonderful writer. If you haven't read any of Dawson's writing, it is absolutely exquisite, and we quoted him substantially in the book, and you'll see a few here. Grinnell didn't think much of him because he tends to be a little flowery in his descriptions, but they're dead on. When you read his descriptions, it may be a little bit over the top in terms of his enthusiasm level, but the observations show exactly what I see in the field, and they're just really, really remarkable. And he has a fantastic 4-volume set of Birds of California, which if you can take out a mortgage on your home, you might be able to find a copy today. All right, anybody who talks about the Sierra has to first define what they're talking about. There is no strict definition of what is and what is not the Sierra Nevada. So we're going to go through the definition of the borders that we use. We want to choose borders fairly straightforward, something that you wouldn't have to be a professional geologist to know if you were in or out. So we tried to choose things that were simple, so you know whether you were in and out, and we chose as the western boundary, so this blue outlines the Sierra Nevada as we defined it. This black line is basically the crest of the Sierra, and we used as the western border the 500-foot elevation line. So that works pretty well. Pretty much most of the way along here, if you're up to 500 feet, you're getting into grapevine, that sort of thing. You're really pretty much into the foothills. We did have to bump it up to about 1,200 feet down here at the southern end, because otherwise Oildale and Kern County becomes part of the Sierra Nevada. Anybody who's been to Oildale and Kern County not in these areas right now. On the north, we kept it really simple. We just said we're going to use Highway 36 as the border. The Cascades and the Sierra just kind of blend together. There's no clear point where you can say I've stepped from the Sierra into the Cascades. And Highway 36 works as well as anything. And down south, we used Highway 58, which goes through Tehachapi, and then through there, and then Highway 14. So that means that actually within the Sierra, there's a little bit of true desert habitat down here in the southeast corner. And then on the east side, we used, for the most part, Highway 395, which is a wonderful, really enjoyable route from north to south. We did include the basins and lakes that are right along 395. So Mono Lake, Honey Lake, we're including in the Sierra. Okay? Well, a fairly generous definition of the Sierra. A few things that are in the book. I'm only going to be able to barely touch the surface of what we have in the book, but it covers primarily natural history. So we cover in detail the life history, a little bit about the habits and nature of each of the nearly 300 species that are regularly occurring. We also include status and distribution, when and where you're likely to find each of those species in the Sierra. There's a little section on origin of names. If you're curious about where the common name or the scientific name came from, we've got a little section that describes each one of the birds. There's a whole section on all the different Sierra habitats as you move from one side to the other, and the characteristic birds you're going to expect to find in each of those habitats. A large section on conservation issues specific to the Sierra. And then we included a small section, and I'll talk about a couple of these tonight, of unsolved mysteries. So there are things that we don't know, we don't understand about what's going on with some Sierra birds. And many of these are things that actually you, as observers, if you spend any time in the Sierra, can actually make contributions to. And I'll go through at least a couple examples tonight. And then we've got a section on rare birds, all the birds that have been seen rarely, or in some cases only once in the Sierra. A little bit about patterns of those, if there is such a thing. And then a section on population trends and range changes. It's been about 30 years since anyone published a comprehensive natural history status and distribution book on the Sierra Nevada. And so a whole lot has happened in the last 30 years in terms of populations increasing, decreasing, new species are found in the Sierra that weren't found 30 years ago. So we devoted quite a bit of the book to that, and I'm going to devote a bit of tonight to that as well. Okay, let's start that. We're talking about trends. So we used two data sources, and luckily the Sierra is fairly rich with sources of data to track population trends. What this shows is those little circles are Christmas bird count circles. So those are counted every winter within the Sierra, and you can see there's a fair number of them. Obviously, you don't get into the very highest, coldest elevations, but they cover a pretty good amount of the Sierra. And the little green squiggly lines, which may be hard to see from the back of the room, those are breeding bird survey routes. So those are run along standard road transects, 25 miles each, and they're run in the breeding season. So we have a pretty good database going back 40, 50 years for both breeding season and winter season populations. And we use those to look for trends, positive or negative, for a host of Sierra birds. And I can give you the very short story. The short story is there's actually more good news than bad. And that may surprise some of you. There are more species increasing than decreasing in the Sierra. So why do I have a question mark by good news? Because some of those species may not be our favorites. Wild turkey. Now, I don't know what the story is over in the Coast Range or along the coast, but I can tell you that there are a lot of wild turkeys in the Sierra foothills on the western coast. And as those of us who live in some of those areas learn pretty quickly, not a very good name. It's really could better be called the not so wild turkey. It's actually become an extremely common sight in some of the foothill towns and even down in the valley. Carmichael, which is a suburb of Sacramento. If you're driving or riding your bike through some of the suburbs, you've got to watch out. You don't run over down turkeys. Of course, gorgeous birds, but as probably most people here know, it is not a native bird to California. Not a native bird. It was actually introduced by Department of Fish and Game in order for us to have another species that we could hunt. And it wasn't easy. They actually tried many times over several years to introduce wild turkeys into California, and they never showed. Mostly they were getting captive raised birds, mostly from the southeast, and they let them loose in California, and they all died. And they let more loose, and they all died. Finally, in 1985, they took some wild-caught birds from Texas, released them in California. This is data from breeding bird survey in the Sierra. This is the average number of birds per breeding bird survey route. That's 1985 right there. So it worked. And this curve shows no sign of slowing down. These birds have become hyper-abundant in many places, particularly in the western foothills. Very successful. Here's a bird that isn't doing so well. Didn't know that song. Well, all better play with it. You think you can't learn a bird song, learn this one, because what's this bird's name? Click 3 beers. Click 3 beers. Okay, so that's one you can remember. Really cool little bird. breeds across all the boreal forest and in the upper elevations, the Rockies and the Sierra. And winters mostly on the east side of the Andes. But this bird is in tremendous and really distressing decline. And this curve, which is what we see in the Sierra over this period, is almost identical to what you see throughout the breeding range of this bird. And they have been in long-term, highly significant decline throughout their breeding range in North America. And we really don't know why. Some of them may be issues, habitat issues here. They certainly don't benefit from things like salvage logging because they like areas with big standing snags close by. There could well be something going on the wintering range. Although most of their wintering range on the east side of the Andes is actually one of the more pristine parts of South America. So we really don't understand. But this is a path to extinction. Let's talk about some birds that are doing well. As I said, more are doing well than others. And I'm going to show you 3 species that are all showing, in the last 30 years, very healthy increases in numbers in the Sierra Nevada. So, tree swallows, doing well. Western bluebirds, doing well. Western bluebirds had declined historically, but the last few decades they've been coming on strong. And we'll just look at a male. And wood duck. So what do you think might those 3 species have in common that could maybe contribute to why they're doing well?
Nest box.
Yeah, nest box, they're all cavity nesters, and more importantly, they all will readily use nest boxes. Wood ducks take these boxes easily, and then western bluebirds, tree swallows, a lot of other species will use these smaller boxes. And over the last 30 years, we've put up a lot of wood duck boxes and a lot of these swallow bluebird boxes. And they do extremely well. I show more pictures of wood ducks. This is actually the view. This is the view that Ted Beatty has from his office. He lives in Nevada City. He has a pond that is full of wood ducks and breeding right in his pond. Gorgeous and ridiculous duck. Okay, this looks like a duck that if you're given a hyperactive 8-year-old a box of crayons, that's what you get. And just to show that tree swallows do use these boxes. A video of the key dancing to it. Here's the baby. You watch really carefully, the fly actually got away. Let's switch back to the species that aren't doing so well, species that are in decline in the last 30 years. One of them is the yellow warbler. Certainly a big part of the reason that those yellow warblers have declined in the Sierra and elsewhere, the ranges have contracted historically by a huge extent, and the numbers have been mostly in decline in the last 30 years. And another species that probably is closely linked for some of the same reasons. This is a curve for Wilson's warbler, also showing a really significant decline in the Sierra. Both these species certainly have been impacted by loss of riparian habitat. Birds that use riparian habitat heavily. But probably the main reason that they're in decline is this. Little brown banded cowbird. And of course, as most people probably know, the problem is not Mr. Cowbird, it's Mrs. Cowbird. Because her approach to motherhood, the brood parasites, her approach to motherhood is that she lays her eggs in the nest of other birds, and that's it. Her mothering is done. She leaves the eggs to be raised by whatever bird's nest that is, and then she's on vacation for the winter.
I don't think we can completely exonerate Mr. Cowbird.
You're right. She's spectacularly well adapted for this. Brown-headed cowbirds have shown to be able to lay as many as 40 eggs in one breeding season. She has a little egg-producing machine. And of course, what she does is she's not picky, she'll lay her eggs in pretty much any nest. And the typical thing you'll see is something like this. A little nest with some yellow warbler eggs and 2 big old brown-headed cowbird eggs. Now, brown-headed cowbirds are not really native to California. They probably, if they were at all in the state, they probably maybe were barely in the eastern edge or barely in the southern edge before the first Europeans arrived. But once the first Europeans arrived, started clearing land, more importantly, brought in cattle. The cowbirds followed the cattle, and pretty quickly there were cowbirds all throughout California. Cowbirds had co-evolved with other species back east, with most of the continent, and so birds had learned, many of them had learned to recognize that there's something wrong with these big old brown spotted eggs, and they would either abandon the nest or they might do something like build another nest on top of it. Our California birds, for the most part, were naive about cowbirds, so cowbirds have had a very big effect, particularly on California birds, because of that naive aspect. So what turns out to happen most of the time when these brown-headed cowbird eggs get laid in there is that the parent goes ahead and sits on the eggs, and 2 or 3 weeks later, you've got a scene like this. You've got a couple of little yellow warbler babies, and then you've got this great big brown-headed cowbird chick. And again, typically the parent sees nothing wrong with this picture, and they proceed to put food into whatever mouth is the biggest and the reddest. And so what happens in most cases with smaller birds is that they go through the season and their chicks die and the cowbird does really fine. It's been documented in a lot of areas where there's heavy cowbird parasitism in things like willow flycatchers, yellow warblers, where season after season, the yellow warblers, willow flycatchers will raise nothing but cowbirds. Year after year, nothing but cowbirds. Had definitely a big effect, particularly in localized areas. And then what will typically happen another 2 or 3 weeks after this, the brown-headed cowbird chick will fledge, and the parents continue to see nothing wrong with the fact that here's the brown-headed cowbird chick. Little warbler daddy. I gotta show that again. It's more video than keeps it. So brown-headed cowbird being fed by its Nixon's warbler daddy. Okay, let's switch back to some good news. So now I'm going to show you 4 species that are all increasing in the last 30 years in the Sierra. And the connection between these 4 is a little more subtle, but see if folks can think that there may be more than just this one reason, but I think it's at least part of it. So, dusky flycatchers are doing well. Most of the flycatchers are not. They're either stable or decreasing, but dusky flycatchers are doing just fine. McGillivray's warbler, doing fine. Spotted towhee, actually doing very well. And lazuli bunting, lazuli bunting, also doing well. So, dusky flycatcher, lazuli bunting, spotted towhee, McGillivray's warbler.
Fire.
What might link these? Yeah, you're 2 steps ahead of me. Well, to some extent, these are all habitat generalists, but they're all birds that like kind of shrubby habitats, and they particularly like shrubby edge habitats. And what creates shrubby edge habitats in the Sierra? As you said, fire. And what we've had in the last 30 or 40 years is a lot more fire, particularly a lot more large-scale stand-clearing fires that really create a lot of this kind of habitat. Is that the whole reason? I don't know, but it may well be part of the reason. And we find that pretty consistently. There are probably, maybe 9 out of 12 of sort of the chaparral type birds and birds that really like fire adapted are all doing well in this area. So